Hi, I'm Leon, and together with Alicia, I am developing the game GOLEMBERT. We have been working on it since the end of 2021 and are about 50% done. So I thought it'd be nice to make a video about the first half of our development process. I organized our so far dev journey in 3 phases: how we came to make GOLEMBERT, prototyping GOLEMBERT, and lastly, actually producing GOLEMBERT. So how did we come to make GOLEMBERT? The whole idea of making a game together popped up in conversations between Alicia and me in early 2020. I had just finished my bachelor's thesis in game design, and Alicia finished her game design internship semester in February when the first COVID lockdown happened. Just like anybody else, we were kinda confused by the weekly changing restrictions and started isolating us as good as possible. That's when we started talking about a future in games. Because after all, I just graduated and Alicia's bachelor thesis was pending for next winter semester. We both didn't really see ourselves working in jobs we did for our internships, but we also weren't really sure how long the pandemic will last / how long it will force us to isolate. So the idea came up to make a game together in the meantime. The first concept that sticked was a minimalistic 3D island colonization game set in the Minoan Aegean. It was partially inspired by old god sims like Populous or Black and White, and minimalistic island games like Islanders or Bad North. But weirdly we, especially I, always found something we didn't like about the concept. We both weren't really into 3D and didn't really play any minimalistic games at all. We also weren't on the same page regarding UI. I'm a big fan of excessive UI, while Alicia loves games that do use as little of it as possible. So coming up with a concept felt like a zero-sum game. One always had to give up an idea they liked for the other's idea to work. Almost a year after our first Let's Make a Game convos, the second lockdown started in Germany. So we generally sat down this time and started our ideation process from scratch. We agreed on making a game in a genre we both at least liked, so no minimalistic game anymore. We also needed constraints that play to our strengths: 2D and management. Alicia's main profession is 2D art, while I am probably the only person I know that likes to do their taxes. Our game should playfully reflect our fundamental personalities. And what game could that be? First up, we wrote down game genres we both really liked and that matched our constraints or that could be made within them. City builders, because we really like the Tropico series and Zeus. 4X strategy games, because we are big Civ 5 and 6 fans. And farming sims, because we really like Stardew Valley and played a lot of Harvest Moon when we were younger. Then we wrote down some things that are important to us and that we wanted in our game. Number 1 was that we really wanted to have people in our game that you can click on and interact with. Maybe that came from the lockdown isolation, but we really wanted to simulate some kind of social relationships and convey a positive community feeling through our game. Absolutely, because of the lockdowns, we were watching a lot of Studio Ghibli movies at the time and started our own balcony garden in 2020. So we felt a natural affinity to include a somehow nature-positive, anti-war and anti-capitalistic message in our game. Ghibli movies often have a lot of Weltschmerz that weirdly makes you sad but calms you down at the same time. And we definitely felt that way during the pandemic. These 2 points already made us heavily lean towards making a farming sim, because if there are 2 things farming games are about, they are nature, meaning mostly agricultural nature, and people. The only downside of traditional farming sims is that they are very capitalistic. That point forced us to set up another list of things that we wanted to include and exclude in our specific farming game. We wanted our game to be anti-capitalistic or at least non-capitalistic. The first solution that came to our minds was that our game shouldn't use currency and only include bartering. And while currency is the foundation of long-distance trade, which is the foundation of the first capitalistic enterprises, there are other capitalistic mechanics we also wanted to avoid or at least treat critically if included. Like markets with competitors that pressure you to act, endless accumulation, and the dependency between capitalists and their workers. We also wanted our game to tell a meaningful story. Most farming games have a deep lore and are heavily story-based. We wanted to embrace that by implementing relatable characters and giving them diverse backgrounds as well as motivations. And lastly, we wanted to make our farming aspect less agricultural and distant from nature. Therefore, we deliberately chose to call our game a gardening game right from the start. In that way, we wanted to dissociate ourselves and our thought process from farming games to have space to define new systems and mechanics that are not particularly farming sim stereotypical. So with all these long rules combined in a kind of social contract between us, we started prototyping a gardening game. Although I studied game design, which included courses about programming, I started GOLEMBERT with a how to make a Stardew Valley-like game tutorial series on YouTube. I didn't really feel confident enough to set up the fundamentals of a game on my own at the start. But after I watched a couple of tutorial episodes and worked along, I got more and more confident and added my own little things. And when the series started implementing combat mechanics, I stopped watching it and worked on my own because we didn't want to have combat in our game. What I missed the most during that process was the feedback of others. So I talked to Alicia, who was already enrolled in the Game System Design Master's program at the HTW Berlin at that time, and still had to do courses before being able to join me in developing, and we came to the conclusion that it would be smart for me to join the Master's program as well. The HTW Berlin has a very nice incubation program with regular coachings and permanent workspaces for founders. Therefore I applied for the program and got accepted. One thing that is essential for if you want to achieve something in life is routine. You need a daily routine, a weekly routine, maybe a monthly or even a yearly routine with things in it that help you achieve the things you want to achieve. Not in an alpha male way where you wake up at 5 AM to do push-ups, but more in a someone who has friends and colleagues that give you a purpose in life kind of way. Having an external structure like a university program you can join, on which you can develop your game and get feedback and help, is way easier than having to find all that resources and making all that structure yourself, at least in a country where education is free. I'm not saying that you cannot develop your game alone at home, you totally can, and we mostly do, but it is much easier if external things like dates, presentations, deadlines, coachings or mentorings force you to talk about your project and therefore reflect its progress, state and meaning. So after we implemented a structural basis for our first dev year, we thought about funding. In Germany there are multiple regional funding bodies specialized in media funding. Their funding sums are usually smaller, addressed to indies and startups and bound to a regional production. There's also a federal, game production specific funding program here that grants larger sums, but it is way more unreliable because its funding is not permanently secured, but depends on the yearly national budget. We only knew from other founders at our university that it is possible to apply for public funding here in Berlin. That's why our first goal was to have a prototype with which we could apply for production funding. For that we still use placeholder assets from the tutorial series I watched. But mechanically we already had the two base systems of our game, planting and harvesting plants, as well as interacting with characters and doing quests for them, implemented. They were still totally rough and not really distinguishable from any other farming sim at that point. But based on that prototype, we were able to explain the vision for our game in a high concept document to the funding authorities and got funded. But funding in this and in most cases doesn't mean that we are a rich man now. We totally lowballed the costs due to totally lowballing the timeline. We thought that our game would be done at the end of 2023 when we applied for funding at the beginning of 2022. So for legal reasons, I cannot really say how poorly we pay ourselves, but I just wanted y'all to know getting public funding is not a way to get rich. Additionally, funding is always chained to a recoupment plan. Developers with private investors or publisher contracts usually have to adhere to strict schedules and milestones, and then end up giving a huge chunk of their profits to their patrons after their game's release. Public funding does not chain us to any timetables and ultimately does not recoup more money than what was invested in us. So if you have to choose between public and private funding, choose public. Now after we spent almost 2 months with applying for university, applying for funding, founding a company, setting up a bank account and getting into accounting, we finally started working on our game together. The main objective for the first couple of months of 2022 were finding an art style and implementing basic systems. The latter meant adding a save system, an audio manager, NPCs and activity scheduling, a node-based dialogue system, a localization system, all that not so specific stuff. But finding an art style was more tricky. We tried out pixel art, but didn't really feel comfortable with it, so we stick with stylized 2D. The problem with stylized 2D is, On the one hand, you don't want it to look too flashy, and on the other hand, you don't want it to look too bloodshot, hyper-realistic eyes-like. Our art style iteration process is really reflected in our island design iterations. We iterated our island multiple times to try out different styles, but also to find the right mix between structural buildings and free space. The latter was really hard for us because we wanted to have an island that has a very high intrinsic guidance, so that the player can already abstract from the design where she can do what. But we also wanted to keep enough space for the player to build their own little garden and for herbs and weeds to appear automatically. If you want to know more about that, you can check out our iteration process in another video we made. Within our master's program's coachings, we talked a lot about the gardening mechanics. Because all of our profs were avid gardeners, their feedback inspired us to base our whole gardening system on the concept of permaculture. If you do not know what permaculture is and want to see how we implemented it in detail, you can check out the video I made about it. Essentially, we implemented a circular garden economy. Crops need water and soil is composted through garden waste, water supplies are refilled by the rain. Water and soil stats of plants are dynamic stats that vary from plant type to plant type. Beside water and soil, a plant also considers its neighborhood. Some crops like specific crops in their proximity, others don't. These factors are all considered for the yield calculation on harvest and lead to a more plant-focused gameplay without overwhelming the player, because the basic interactions are still the same as in other farming games. Click to water or fertilize your plant, click to harvest, hover over to get more infos. One thing we did repeatedly over 2022 was playtesting our prototype and bug fixing it. Playtesting things yourself or letting someone playtest is really important to see which things come across and which don't. Especially for UX design, playtesting and analyzing playtestings is important. Therefore, we tried to get as much gameplay footage from screens of people that tested our game to really see what they were thinking, doing, getting, and not getting. So after we found our art style, permaculture gardening as our main mechanic, and playtested a lot, we realized that the year was almost coming to an end and that maybe we overscaled our scope. Because initially we planned our early game to be about building your own small ship so that you can visit 3 other islands inhabited by NPCs. And we weren't even done with our main island after a year. So we reversed that formula. Instead of the player visiting the NPC's islands, we decided that the NPCs will visit the player island on their ships. We also reduced the number of NPCs drastically. Initially we planned to have more than 20, after our first reduction we planned to have 10. The year 2022 ended with the first batch of funding getting transferred into our bank account. Especially all that paperwork after we got our funding granted took a lot of time. Keep that in mind if you're going for public or private funding as well. So fittingly, after we paid us our first wages, we started the production phase of GOLEMBERT. Because we finished all our master's courses in 2022, we looked out for another form of structural support system we could use for regular communication with other devs. That's when we found the Startup Games Entrepreneurs Workshop series by the Stiftung Digitale Spielekultur. It's an over half a year long program with almost bi-weekly workshops and mentorings by industry professionals here in Berlin. Which sounded really good, so we applied for it and luckily got accepted. That meant that we had our structural routine worked out right at the start of the year. Viewed from the outside, the biggest step we did in 2023 was announcing our game publicly. Though we weren't really that confident at the time, we started to post on social media and making videos on YouTube. The one thing that really encouraged us to do so was an event we visited because of the Startup Workshop series, where a dev and a publisher talked about their game's journey. That's one of the many benefits when you have a support system that encourages you to do things you were unconsciously avoiding or insecure about. Development-wise, we had all the fundamentals done. Permaculture gardening worked, one could do quests, save and load, etc. But our game really missed a lot of feedback and guidance. So we added basic feedback animations for crops, a harvesting animation, hints that pop up at certain points, and a permanent UI for currently active quests. Making your player feel like they know what their options of actions are and where they can get the information they need to make a decision is really the most crucial thing one has to do when producing a game. Based on the scope reduction we agreed on at the end of our prototyping phase, we experimented with different garden layouts to give our players the ability to decorate their garden as much as possible. We also reworked our story as well as its dialogues. But the whole reduction process really came and comes in waves and is still going on, so we'll probably still rewrite dialogues in the future. Alongside reducing overscoped content and cleaning up the basic systems, we still feature creeped a little bit and added a node-based potion crafting system that the player feeds with her garden yields. Further, we added small garden creatures that roam your garden and help you with your crops if you are nice to them. We temporarily call them herbies and are still in the process of designing them. Currently, we are writing dialogues and quests, as well as rendering the island and the NPCs. For this year, we plan to have the whole island and its inhabitants rendered and all main quests playable. There are still a few things to do before Golembert is fully done, animating a lot and producing a soundtrack for example, but we'll keep you updated on our progress in our devlogs and our other social media, so feel free to follow us. We are also really happy about all the support and feedback we get from you, so if you have any wishes for the game or additions we should make, feel free to comment them below. Be sure to wishlist Golembert if you are interested in the game and don't want to miss any big announcement. Hope to see you in the next video. Bye!